Pyro is a close range class, and when your primary weapon already deals with every enemy who gets close to you, your melee weapons, typically reserved for last resort, end up needing some kind of utility or strength that your flamethrower can't provide to be viable. Before even properly starting the video then, the default fire axe is getting ruled out immediately. It objectively provides nothing to the Pyro when all of his primary weapons can already deal more than enough damage at close range. And if you're out of ammo, you probably shouldn't be engaging the enemy anyway. With that out of the way then, today I'm discussing every one of Pyro's melee weapons. As I just mentioned, they generally need to serve some kind of utility or special purpose in order to be viable, which makes them a pretty unique case among the other classes aside from heavy. Some are almost impossible to play without, and some are, well, the volcano fragment, but we'll get to that. First, we'll start with the weapons that I think are actually alright and are in a pretty great state in terms of balance: the back scratcher and the extinguisher. Starting with the former, the back scratcher has pretty clear situations in which you should or should not use it. You do a lot more damage and get 1.5 times the amount of normal health from health packs, which is really useful, but you get significantly less healing from dispensers, medics, and the payload cart. If your team has a medic, or if your engineer has a particularly useful dispenser, don't use it. If neither of those things are the case though, which is pretty common in pubs, let's be honest, the bonus health from packs then becomes very useful, and even the damage bonus can come into play sometimes, acting as a bit of a pseudo-extinguisher, due to how much damage it does per swing. Speaking of, the extinguisher is also a weapon that I think is in pretty good shape balance-wise, surprisingly. It's easy to say it's not a great weapon given it isn't nearly as useful as it used to be during its glory days, but it still has its niche. Finishing off low health classes is pretty consistent, and every kill you get in burning enemies gives you a small speed boost, which is more useful than you might think. I'd say if you're playing optimally, this thing can kill classes a bit faster than the flamethrower. Just be sure you actually end up killing the enemy with your hits, as once you hit a burning enemy, they're extinguished. It also works pretty great as a way to get some fancy kills if you're good enough. Not nearly as good as it used to be for sure, but it's far from useless, and I really recommend giving it a try. Now it's time for some bad weapons. In fact, these are all so useless that I'm going to combine them into a single segment right here and explain why each of them ends up being a pathetic excuse for a weapon. The third degree's primary use is being the only straight upgrade in the game, while still being terrible. Pretty impressive. Without relying on random crits, there is very little reason to use this thing. When you're attacking medics or players with a medic with your flamethrower, your flames pass right through them, and oftentimes hit the other player in the medic-pocket relationship as well anyway. This means that the incredible, unmatched upside that the third degree has is something the flamethrower already excels at, and even in the rare case that it doesn't, at least the flamethrower does decent enough damage to kill things consistently. If you get a good kill with a third degree, it's either because you got a random crit, or because the enemy was too dumb to notice you and kill you in time. Two things you don't want to bank on every time you use a weapon. Next up, the Neon Annihilator. It crits any enemy who is either submerged in water or covered in mad milk or durrbill, not including the gas passer somehow. Water is incredibly rare and mostly only works as a gimmick, and if any players nearby you are covered in mad milk or durrbill, you have a nearly 100% chance to kill them already with your flamethrower if you focus fire them for any amount of time. The ability to remove sappers only turns it into a worse homewrecker at the same time. The best thing about this weapon is how cool it looks. The hot hand is an absolute joke of a weapon, and I feel offended on the game's behalf that it even exists. As a meme, I'd say it's mediocre at best given the fish is clearly superior, and as a weapon it has no uses. The speed boost you get after hitting an enemy goes away before it can ever be useful, and that's the only positive trait this weapon has. The double slap mechanic is unique, but it ends up just making it harder to actually land all of that whopping 58 damage. Finally, on durrbill's big angry list of terrible weapons, is the sharpened volcano fragment, what I argue to be the most useless weapon in the game.
Gives me conniptions.
It sets people on fire when you hit an enemy, does less base damage, and nothing else. If you're this close to an enemy and you want to set them on fire, you have a flamethrower that will do infinitely more damage than this thing could ever hope to achieve. Some say it has a use when you run out of ammo, but being in a situation where you have no ammo in a firefight is something you should literally always try to avoid 100% of the time. And even then, you're better off just finding more ammo or running away. I would say medieval mode gives this thing a place to be viable, but the back scratcher completely outshines it there, so it doesn't even have that. After covering 6 weapons, we aren't exactly on a good streak, so we'll move on to something generally considered to be much more useful, the homewrecker. Some might be wondering why I didn't cover this thing back with a back scratcher and extinguisher, but that's because I have my own grips with this thing, but we'll get to that in a second. Firstly, the homewrecker is actually pretty useful for support of Pyro. Removing sappers in a single hit is nice, and it helps your engineer a lot by taking some of the stresses of engie life into your own hands. The lower damage against players doesn't matter much either, given that if you're using this thing, you're probably near a dispenser, meaning you'll never run out of ammo, and will have no reason to not use your flamethrower for close range encounters. However, I am not a fan of the homewrecker, despite its usefulness. The the reason for which can generally be summarized as this: it's unnecessary. The homewrecker's sole purpose is to remove sappers from buildings to help out with enemy spies, which I think is pretty redundant when Pyro as a class already excels at killing even the best spies with ease. There is no feeling worse than outplaying one or more engineers, sapping their sentries and hearing that tiny little sound, completely invalidating any work you put into destroying a nest. When a class's abilities are already so effective at killing spies, the homewrecker feels less like a new way to play Pyro and more like a middle finger to spies. Some might also say that it encourages teamwork between players, helping each other out, but honestly, I'd argue the opposite. If you're playing Pyro to help out your engineer, I'd say the most effective and much more interesting way of helping your team is actively spy checking around, and when you do find the spy, focusing on not letting them get near your NG's buildings with your A-blast. It encourages a kind of lazy playstyle where you can still be incredibly effective at helping the engineer even if you hardly pay attention to enemy spies and their attack patterns. It's unnecessary given Pyro is already so good at killing spies, and it encourages boring and lazy playstyles of teamwork that ends up just being frustrating for spy players who already have to play incredibly well to maneuver around a teamwork-focused Pyro. Last, and absolutely not least, is the Power Jack. Bar none, the best melee weapon for Pyro. The Extinguisher, pretty useful on certain kills. Back Scratcher, not bad if you have a medic. Power Jack, literally always useful. Moving Faster is the single strongest ability in the game when you think about it. One of the most important traits of every class that people consider to be the strongest is the ability to move around quickly when they need to. Giving a bit of this ability to Pyro makes you way more mobile and makes getting around the map so much faster. As I once said, the more situations in which a weapon is useful, the better it's considered to be. And the Power Jack demonstrates this better than almost any other weapon in the game. The only situation in which this thing isn't useful is when you're actively being attacked or attacking an enemy, and when that's the case, you shouldn't be holding out your melee weapon anyway, almost no matter what weapon you're using. And even then, getting a kill with this thing still gives you a small 25 health bonus for some reason. Of course, this isn't saying other melee weapons don't have their uses, but I don't think any of them are nearly as useful as the Power Jack. It's hard to say if this thing is overpowered really, more so I think most of the Pyro's other melee weapons just suck. Like, really, there was an entire update focused around Pyro, and not a single one of his near-useless melee weapons were even touched, and now more than half of his melee arsenal has nearly zero reason to be used ever. And again, that isn't to say they're 100% useless and don't have a single use case, but those use cases that do exist are so horribly rare or specific to where there ends up just being no practical reason to use them aside from memeing. Now, as for what I think we should do to fix this, I think it's pretty obvious. Remove the cloak drain penalty from the return reward, please, please, please.